So I'd like to start off with a question and ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have ever been annoyed by someone being distracted, checking their phone, and not socializing with you? And out of curiosity, how many of you think that smartwatches might make this even worse? Okay. So in this talk, I'll show you how smartwatches can be a powerful tool to manage our digital lives and our availability, and avoid situations like this. So, despite market figures showing that the wearable shipments, including smartwatches, is rising, if we look at media, there's still a lot of debate in terms of what is the added value of a smartwatch. And if we look at related work, we still know very little about the actual user experience of smartwatches. What we do know is that people do like glancing at their information on their wrist, and it's not surprising given that we receive, on average, 60 notifications per day. We also know that using smartwatches for notifications is the second most popular use after checking the time. And we also know that smartwatches have this always-on-the-wrist nature that allows hands-free interactions. So it's reasonable to believe that by increasing access to notification, smartwatches might exacerbate this always-online checking and almost in fear of missing out of information, especially if we consider that smartwatches are a second screen to our phones. And being always online and always connected is viewed as an issue by many people, as they feel that they're not in control of their time. There are different solutions that are being suggested. One of the most recent ones is a government level. So earlier this year in France, there was a law that was passed that allows people to disconnect from technology at the end of a working day. So it breaks that cycle of having to be always available that flexible working has enabled and encouraged. However, how is this going to change now that technology is strapped to our wrists and is not just in our pockets or in our bags? So, what are the benefits and challenges of wearing a device that is always on, but also always online? And how do smartwatches fit within our multi-device ecologies? So last month, we published a paper in IEEE Computer magazine where we discussed the implications of smartwatches for work-life balance. And the title is a nice way of summarizing our overall research question in a more playful and provocative way. Are smartwatches digital handcuffs, or are they magic bracelets, to use Wonder Woman's example? So today I'll present findings from our qualitative work and show what is the added benefit of smartwatches as a communication technology. And if we think of computer-mediated communication and how it happens, especially on a smartwatch, we first receive a notification. Then we need to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to be available? Am I going to reply? And then, if I do want to reply, we need to decide on what device. So I will follow this pipeline when presenting my findings today. And ultimately, by understanding the situated use of smartwatches for communication purposes within the ecology of multi-devices, you will reconsider the value of smartwatches as a powerful tool to manage our availability. Before I go into detail, though, I just wanted to briefly present our method. So we used a mixed method approach, and at the time of the research, this was conducted in 2014, 2015, there was not a lot of work on user experience of smartwatches. So I carried out a 2-month out-of-the-box autoethnography where every day I collected diary entries about my own experience, as well as comments and reactions from friends and family for a total of 60 people. And this helped me understand the situated use in a more nuanced way. It also allowed me to take into account non-users' perspective, as well as inform the interview questions. So then I interviewed 17 men from tech companies who are self-identified as early adopters. And I asked questions such as motivations for purchase, initial setup, changes made over time, everyday use and non-use, perceived benefits, and issues or unmet needs. Then collated the diary entries and the interview transcripts and analyzed them thematically. So we recruited a wide range of participants that had all sorts of different smartwatches, as you can see in the pictures. And they all had owned them for a varied amount of time, ranging from 3 weeks to over 2 years, with an average of 8 months of ownership. And all participants had one smartwatch, with the exception of one person who had first backed a Pebble on Kickstarter and then bought an Apple Watch, so he owned 2 of them. And on average, participants had 5.5 devices each between laptops, smartphones, tablets, and smartwatches. So, overall, receiving notifications on smartwatches was considered the main benefit. But obviously, not all notifications are equal, right? They're not all important. So after an initial novelty effect, where settings were not changed, we did find that more than half of our participants disabled at least some notifications. So they only allowed a subset of their smartphone notifications, to their smartwatch. So like participant 10 says, customizing your wearable gives you control. It feels good to be in control over technology. And when we asked why they disabled these notifications, participants stated that these notifications were annoying and they wanted to be less distracted. And if we think about it, they could have done this just using their phone without a smartwatch, but the smartwatch allowed them to get that distance and enabled them to change the settings. Participants also wanted more contextual notifications, so they would create either manual or automatic rules, such as enabling the do not disturb function every night. Or in the case of participant 4, who says, I have from time to time stopped certain notifications, for example, if I'm out for dinner with friends, or something like that. However, the current levels of customizations are not satisfying for everyone. We found that participants wanted more fine-grained controls that could work independently from the various communication channels. So participant 10 complains about email, for example. He says, I don't have the luxury to decide I want emails only from this specific person. And participant 6 compares it with Twitter and says, Twitter sort of lets you enable notifications for certain people. That's good. But then, on the other hand, with WhatsApp, I would have to go on WhatsApp and disable, almost in an all or nothing, the notifications. But what if I had something important? And there was a talk on Monday by Noen, Skridger, and McKay on how people use WhatsApp and how they use it for very different purposes with different people. And here we see how the kind of nuanced settings apply also to different devices. Wearing or not wearing a device was also another way for participants to gain control over when to be notified. For example, taking it off when getting home after a day of work helped the users disconnect from their daily life and being constantly available. So participant 8 explains, I try to use it when I'm driving or I'm in the office, but once I'm home, I can just disconnect from my smartwatch to stay away from my phone and business emails. So once a user receives a notification, he or she is facing 3 options. They either ignore it, they dismiss it, or they read it. And whichever one they pick, they still send a message to the other person about their availability. And participants used notification settings not just to decide when, where, and how to be notified, but also to have an increased flexibility in terms of when to reply. And this increased flexibility of when to reply was particularly useful when awareness cues were involved. So awareness cues are things like the blue ticks on WhatsApp, or read receipts, or when you see last seen online at 2 p.m. And some participants really relied on smartwatches to avoid sending these awareness cues to the other person. And participant 11 explains this quite well. He says, another nice feature of the smartwatch is that you can read the message without them seeing that you've seen it. So they don't feel offended that you're ignoring them. However, we found that mental models between users and non-users were not always shared. And the autoethnography was really good at uncovering the mental models of non-users. And we found that at least some of the non-users expected users to be even more responsive and more available as a result of wearing a watch. So this is exemplified in the interaction as reported in the diary. A friend of mine was texting me saying, hey, how are you? He wanted to meet up, and I hadn't seen the message. And then later he calls me out and he says, I know you have this watch, and I know you see my messages. So then eventually, when I did see the message, I replied and I explained, I don't get notified by every single app. So we see that non-smartwatch users did not have this clear mental model of how a smartwatch could be used if I'm always having it online, what notifications I'm enabling. And it sometimes can pose a challenge if we use smartwatches to help manage our availability. So then, after receiving a notification on a smartwatch and deciding, yes, I do want to reply, we face the choice of which device. And different smartwatches allow different degrees of reply. So some of them you can just read the notifications. Others you have like canned responses, or you can use voice interaction. And there's a model from a Samsung smartwatch that has a full QWERTY keyboard as well. Smartwatches generally prompted shorter replies to urgent messages, or they were used to negotiate a better time to communicate. So as participant 3 explains, I usually reply on my watch if there's an element of urgency or if it's a very short and easy reply. And participant 13 goes on and says, it makes, in some cases, the communications more polite. Just because someone wants to be more synchronous doesn't mean that I have to be. So the distance that a smartwatch provides from a smartphone extends also to the ability to make the interaction more polite and negotiate a better time for availability. Without having to pull out my phone and interrupt whatever task I'm currently involved in or social interaction. Generally, smartphones generated slower response to non-urgent messages. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The burden of pulling out my phone from my pocket or my bag is not justified. If I just glance at my wrist and, oh yeah, it's not important, I'll ignore it. And participant 1 explains this quite well. He says, I'm far more likely to respond if I'm on my laptop, and it's way more easy to type on that. Whereas if I'm away from my laptop, I can't be arsed to get the phone out and send something. So this selective responsiveness across devices can help users align their behaviors with their values of whether they want to be available or not, or delaying a message to a later time. However, these values and behaviors there might be a mismatch and can be challenged if there is a readily available device there to use. And I believe the next paper by Vizuri provides some insight here comparing the smartphone and the smartwatch use. So pulling these threads together, all these behaviors I've just presented are considered strategies that our participants used in order to regain control over their availability. And building on some of our previous work, we defined these as microboundaries. So we previously defined microboundaries as user-designed strategies that help users shift from a more mindless interaction with technology to a more conscious way of engaging with devices and information that it provides. And in this study, we found 4 examples of microboundaries. Social ones, so for example, disabling them when I go out for dinner with friends. Temporal, so enabling the do not disturb every night. Digital, so disabling selected notifications on selected devices, as we see in the picture here where the person is engaged in reading a book and is completely oblivious of all the distractions that are happening on the phone. And physical microboundaries, so deciding when not to wear or wear a device or carry a device. So moving forward, in order for smartwatches to become more widespread and at the same time avoid them becoming another source of interruption, we urge designers to take into account the strategies that people use in order to improve the user experience of smartwatches. And one way of doing this is by decentralizing the notification settings so that they're no longer linked to specific communication apps, but more linked to context and devices. So concluding, I've told you how people use smartwatches for communication and how they can be beneficial. I've presented how smartwatch notifications could be designed and how these devices fit within our multi-device ecologies and how they can even help users manage their availability. And ultimately, by understanding the situated use of smartwatches within our multi-device ecologies, you will have reconsidered how they can be a useful tool to manage our digital lives. So I would like to thank you and thank Google for sponsoring my trip to come here and present this work.
Hi.
Hi.
Vasilis Kostakos, University of Melbourne. Thank you for the talk. I want to ask about whether you have any insight on why people might quit using smartwatches. So the people you interviewed had been using them for a while, so I imagine they liked them. They hadn't given up on them. And I wonder whether you got any insight on some of the features or characteristics that made them think about giving up on them.
So there was one participant that was that eventually was considering stopping using the smartwatch because he was very frustrated with the redundancy of notifications, because the ones that he did enable, his watch was buzzing and his phone was buzzing, and in some cases the laptop as well. So that was one of the issues. Personally, I'm wearing it today, but I've stopped using it for over a year, and the reason is because I've noticed that the notifications are not that urgent or important, so I know I can just wait till whenever I'm free to check my phone. But definitely there's more work to be done in understanding the abandonment of these devices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lindsay Franklin, Pacific Northwest National Lab. The people that you interviewed were, you said, kind of the early adopters, so they're probably the more tech-savvy types.
Yeah.
Do you get the sense that maybe their use was because they're more comfortable with maybe early interfaces that are still a little bit clunky? Do you think maybe that some of the usage patterns might be different? Well, sorry, let me ask this a different way. Do you get the sense that the usage patterns were because maybe it was more complicated to do things on the watch compared to a phone, whereas people would stop prioritizing things kind of the same way if it was easier to do more of that on your watch?
Well, they did stop. They did prioritize things on their watch. Some people did complain that it was a bit, they had to fiddle and find the settings, and it took some time. So definitely how the notification settings are enabled on a watch versus a phone, it should be improved and made simpler. But because the watch is on your wrist, every notification becomes a lot more salient. So they were really thinking about, do I really want to be buzzed every few minutes? And there was one person that actually did welcome having 140 emails come in every day.
Okay, all right, thank you.
It's the benefits of qualitative research, right?
Yeah, wow, thank you.
We can definitely do one more question. Can we